Sir.
So brothers, welcome to this evening's presentation. Our webinar series this evening will be the introduction to the Scottish Rite Masonry in Minnesota on this fantastic St. Patrick's Day evening. You know, a couple of things to keep in mind, brothers. This is not a tiled meeting, so please govern yourselves accordingly. These sessions are being recorded. We ask that you maintain a stay of silence. Please put your mics on mute. If you have some questions or things that you would like to address with the host, we ask that you hold those questions and those inquiries until David has had a chance to give his full presentation. At that time, we encourage you to fully engage. There will be a slight poll that takes place for approximately 5 minutes at that time. As we conclude that, I will post those results. And keep in mind that these are recorded, so they are available for future use. You can find those through the Grand Lodges. They're getting loaded up on the new Grand View. You'll see them more growing in there, and they're also available for a time on the Grand Lodge YouTube. So please reach out to any of the committees if you do struggle seeming to gain access to any of them. The upcoming events, Finding Time For, will be presented next Wednesday, the 24th, by Worshipful Brother Bradley Phelps. We will be able to get a second run of this on the 31st of March, the introduction to the York Rite. My apologies, it is the York Rite Masonry in Minnesota given by Worshipful Brother David Kampf. So that should be a great one there. We are going to take a break, it looks like, for the annual communications coming up on the 7th of April. And you brothers can see that we've got some great stuff filling our ability for deism and the religious philosophy of Masonry for April. So please join Most Worshipful Brother Terry Tilton for that presentation. We have a current Grand Lodge initiative taking place, the Show and Tell Challenge. This is a great opportunity for you to get with your brothers in your lodge and look for a way to express Masonry. What is Masonry in Minnesota? What will your life and legacy say about Masonry? Or perhaps how will you help others find their way to rewards of the craft? So please reach out to bythecompass.org challenge or any of the committee individuals if you want more information on that. One more announcement for you is the virtual trivia contest. The Minnesota Masonic Charities looking to bring some fun to you on Friday, April 9th. Please go to the Minnesota Masonic Charities and register for a Masonic Histories and Mysteries Trivia Night. If you have any questions, please reach out to Brother John Scheitz, or you can reach him at his email there, but you can register at minnesotamasoniccharities.org. And with that, time for me to turn this over to our feature presentation to be given by Worshipful Brother David Kampf. I am going to stop sharing, and as we say, the con is yours, brother.
That works nicely. Let's see, we do that. And lo and behold, it says that I am sharing my screen, which is all good. I think I should be 5 by 5. I've got a couple of monitors in front of me, so please forgive me for not staring directly into the camera while doing this, because I've got notes and some other pertinent things on a separate screen here. But indeed, welcome to everyone this evening. It's a great pleasure to be able to do this, to be able to talk about Scottish Rite. I can't say as much about the pleasure of my volunteering for 2 weeks hence, since there was an opening in the schedule, and I was kind of like, well, you know, as long as I'm warmed up doing this, and I've got a little bit of knowledge about York Rite Masonry in Minnesota, I did indeed suffer the lost Masonic word and didn't come up with the word no. And so in 2 weeks, you'll get to see me somewhat reprise this presentation and talk about, I hope, some of the same things, only different, with regards to York Rite Masonry in Minnesota. And for that presentation in 2 weeks, I do have the blessing of our grand officers from the York Rite body. So if you don't like it, you can hold them responsible. How's that sound? So I will press on. I want to, before I start, make sure I send a shout out and a thanks to many of the officers in our Scottish Rite, Don Nolly, Terry Henthorne, Roger Schmid, Steve Stromsness, Mark Anderson, guys that preceded me in using bits or pieces or all our arts and parts of this presentation that we use in the Minneapolis Valley to introduce candidates to the Scottish Rite in Minneapolis. Obviously, I've stepped this to a different level to talk more generically about the state of Minnesota. I'm also very indebted to Worshipful Brother Terrence Schaefer and Worshipful Brother Dan Aitkins. Over the years, those two guys have provided some just great photographs, some of which I've incorporated in this evening. And as the note said, this is not a tiled meeting. I know there's Scottish Rite members in attendance. There's Master Masons in attendance. I don't know if we have any non-Masons in attendance, but because of the structure of the meeting, I'm going to avoid most all of the conversations about the Hiramic legend and those things that we know. So if you've got follow-up questions later, pretty much everyone knows where to find Dave. Pressing on, every good Scottish Rite or Masonic thing starts with a nice background. The Scottish Rite Creed, which is indeed just incredibly Masonic, looking for equal rights to all, the guarantee of that liberty across all cultures, society, and people is just the creed of the Scottish Rite. And I've heard many, many times over, I believe in an absolute truism, no presentation about the Scottish Rite is ever to start or end without somewhere along the line encompassing a quote from Albert Pike. I got a couple of things on Pike here this evening, but I want to make sure that folks know this is not a presentation on Pike. Pike had a tremendous influence on Scottish Rite Masonry, but the origins and the depths and the current day of the Scottish Rite goes way beyond even some of the things that Albert Pike could have imagined. But certainly what speaks for us after we are gone as being immortal is indeed a great quote. The ancient and accepted Scottish Rite to Freemasonry for the southern jurisdiction of the United States of America. Deep breath. There's a lot there to unpack, but I thought at least starting out with a little bit of levity, there of course is an elephant in the room, and that elephant is that most things, probably all things having to do with the Scottish Rite has very, very, very little to do with Scotland. It just isn't that way. What we have as the present Scottish Rite is actually derived a little bit from French, but mostly from German origin, and came to the United States in the early 1800s. The symbols, and I will talk about symbols as we progress through. The symbols, the predominance of them that we have, come from Prussia, from the great king and ruler Frederick II, who was purported to be the Grand Master and the protector of the order of the Holy House of the Temple of Solomon, which is today another euphemism for our Scottish Rite. From these symbols and from the degrees and from the lessons and from the organization, you can see that there is an amazing interconnectedness with the York Rite that I'll get to talk about in a couple of weeks. But indeed, the Scottish Rite and the York Rite are two very, very different Masonic bodies. Go back to this slide and the title, because there's some more unpacking to be done, and that really has to do with the fact that what's with the southern jurisdiction stuff? Why do I keep hearing that come up? And if there's a southern, is there a northern? And the answer is absolutely yes. If you hadn't intended on a history lesson or a geography lesson this evening, again, no Scottish Rite presentation is complete without a map of the United States. If we dial back to about 1802, and I believe this map is accurate in and around that time frame, 1800 to 1802, you can see what the United States looked like at the time. It's interesting, this is not an eye test, there's many areas that are called disputed areas, and that's sort of an interesting historical lesson in the early growth and stabilization of our country. It's also kind of interesting to see what is now Ohio and then the part of Michigan is called the Northwest Territory, which I don't know, that's at the time it was pretty Northwest, but not too much of what we know today. The important takeaways here are that 1801 saw the establishment of the Scottish Rite in the United States of America. And if you look at the map of the United States at that time, contemplate where those boundaries of disputed area or colonies of France and Spain and unclaimed territory, we look at that map of the United States today and we see very clearly delineated a southern Masonic jurisdiction and a northern Masonic jurisdiction. Those areas east of the Mississippi and north of the Ohio River were ceded to the northern Masonic jurisdiction way back in the very early 1800s. The southern jurisdiction, because is the mother council of the world, claimed all the rest of the territory in the United States and indeed a great number of foreign, not properties, but foreign territories overseas. And I'll cover some of that later because there's some math coming up, but there isn't really a test coming up. So we'll get a chance to look at that. Something that's very unique about the Scottish Rite has to do with its organization and the fact that there is indeed at the national level, there is a unique Scottish Rite organization, which is very different than what's followed in most, if not all, Grand Lodges in the United States. There are many similarities. The Grand Lodges are wholly sovereign unto themselves within their state, and the Scottish Rite in each of the states, both northern and southern jurisdiction, are sovereign unto themselves with regards to which Rite is unique from that standpoint. Its headquarters are in Washington, D.C. Clearly, there is not going to be a test on this slide later on. I'm not going to ask anyone to memorize names or faces or pictures, but if someone does a really quick count, they're going to call Dave a liar because here's our Supreme Council. There's actually only 29 guys in this picture, and the reason is, as you can guess with any group of men, age, I don't know, bottom end, early to mid 50s, I think at the earliest, up till their 80s, any group of 33 men you're going to find, some are coming and going in life. And so right now there are only 29 active members on our Supreme Council. Another important point is that we have a sovereign Grand Commander, James Cole, 33rd degree sovereign Grand Commander of our Supreme Council. He's the head over the entire southern jurisdiction. Jim Cole is just a brilliant guy. He is an accountant by training and by profession, past Grand Master of Masons in the state of Virginia. Here's another interesting part, distinguished from many, many other Masonic bodies. Our Sovereign Grand Commander serves until his retirement or his removal. It is not quite, but essentially a lifetime engagement for him. Jim Cole took over in 2019, and those of us that were in Washington had an opportunity to see the passing of the tools, the passing of a torch from a guy who was just a legend as our Sovereign Grand Commander to a new man in Jim Cole. Again, it's just a great guy, and he will serve until his retirement. There is not, as we see in many, many Masonic bodies, a progressive line in the Scottish Rite or in the Supreme Council. Talked about the Supreme Council. There are 33, nominally 33 active members. They're all called Sovereign Grand Inspector General with the authority over all the Scottish Rite within their state. And for the purposes of the Scottish Rite, it's called an Orient. Again, inside the Orient, there is not a progressive Masonic line within the Scottish Rite. I get to go back to this wonderful map because, as I said previously, there's a bit of a pesky math problem here. You don't need to count it. There won't be a test. But when we include Alaska and Hawaii, there are 35 states in the southern jurisdiction. but we have to account for the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico, territories of the United States, Guam, and if you're a study or a reader of even current history in the United States Congress, there are those that forget that Guam is a territory of the United States. Guam is connected with Hawaii just because it's sort of out there, the closest thing. But when you add those other territories and other provinces and other entities that the southern jurisdiction contains, you all of a sudden see that there's a problem. There's more than 33 states or territories. And the reason is, in order to keep the Supreme Council at a count of 33, some of those states and territories do not have an SGIG. They have a deputy who oversees all of the operation in that state. Before I leave this chart of the U.S., I want to point out one additional thing, and it's pretty clear that us in Minnesota here, the history of Scottish Rite Masonry in Minnesota includes the fact that we're right next door to the Northern Masonic jurisdiction. What I'm about to say goes true in Scottish Rite Masonry, it goes true in Masonry, and it's true just as the general health and welfare of a human being. If you have the opportunity to travel, I heartily encourage you to travel. If not for a Masonic sense, if for your own personal growth and edification, but if you get a chance to visit a Masonic lodge in another state or in another country, or you get a chance to visit a Scottish Rite jurisdiction in the northern, or a Scottish Rite Orient in the northern jurisdiction, or across the world, which I have done, it is indeed one of the most enriching things you'll ever have an opportunity to do. I heartily, heartily encourage it. One more thing before I leave on the subject of travel. The headquarters for our Supreme Council in Washington, D.C. is called the House of the Temple. It is a magnificent building situated virtually in the center of Washington, D.C. It's where the Supreme Council has their chambers. The building is open for tours, notwithstanding the current coronavirus restrictions. All visitors are welcome to the House of the Temple for tours when the building is open. All Master Masons are certainly welcome and encouraged to attend. But if you're a member of the Scottish Rite and you understand only a thumbnail worth of the symbolism of our Scottish Rite, your trip to the House of the Temple in Washington will not be lost. It will be a remarkable journey for you. I'll leave on that when talking about travel and the stuff in Washington. And as promised, I want to turn to Scottish Rite Masonry in Minnesota. In the Scottish Rite, in all of the Orients, Minnesota included, the cities where there is a Scottish Rite, it's called a valley, synonymous with the term city. In Minnesota, we have 5 valleys: Duluth, Rochester, and I won't read them here because you're going to read them yourself. And any studier, any person who's studied Minnesota says, gee, with those 5 cities, principally the 4 of them, you have reached the largest demographic of people and certainly of Masons in the state of Minnesota. If you look at those statistical metropolitan areas, if you love that statistical stuff. A key thing that's very, very strong here is that our Scottish Rite enjoys an incredibly strong working relationship with our Grand Lodge across the state of Minnesota. The Masonic edifices, the buildings, the temples of the Scottish Rite, I've really only got a few slides here of those temples, but they are among the grandest Masonic facilities in the state of Minnesota. Each of the ones I've shown, and indeed all of the Scottish Rite facilities across Minnesota, actually play host to multiple Masonic groups in their building, in their temple. And so, again, strengthening that connection of our Scottish Rite to the Grand Lodge and the constituent lodges and even the York Rite bodies within the state of Minnesota. Talking about our leadership, this is part of my job. I have to always bring greetings from our Sovereign Grand Inspector General in the Orient of Minnesota, illustrious Tony Krall, 33rd degree. He was in that picture. If you wanted to see his face, it was really small back there. He was, as we would say, in the bald-headed section, way in back. But Tony is our active member of the Supreme Council. He is the 12th Sovereign Grand Inspector General to serve Minnesota since 1860. There have been a few deputies in there as they have transitioned between SGIGs, but he is only the 12th so designated Sovereign Grand Inspector General in the state of Minnesota, in the history of Minnesota and in the history of Minnesota Masonry. And many, many, many know also that Tony serves on our Grand Lodge line. That dual service in the Grand Lodge and as a very leadership position in the Scottish Rite is certainly not rare in the Scottish Rite. It happens a number of times in other places, but I'm sure that Tony will be for us, has been for us so far since 2019 when he was elected to the Supreme Council until now, a great leader. Again, the leadership in the valleys, and I'm not quite there yet, is still very, very different than the progressive line officers that we typically see in Masonic bodies in Minnesota. Each valley has up to 5 appointed officers. Whoops, got too far ahead of myself. Those 5 appointed officers in each valley serve at the will and pleasure of the SGIG. They can be appointed and or removed at any time by the SGIG. They serve at his will and pleasure. That's kind of a significant difference from what else we know in Masonry in Minnesota. The principal leaders are what's called the personal representatives, and that's a term that's kind of uncommon in Masonry, but is very common inside the Scottish Rite and indeed outside the Scottish Rite. The definition of the personal representative's job, literally and figuratively, and I can point you literally and figuratively, and I can point you to the exact page in the Supreme Council statutes, which defines the job as basically being the eyes and ears of the SGIG or deputy in a particular valley. You can see some very, very well-known people in Masonry in Minnesota, past Grand Master Ray, Chuck Brust, Norm Voigt, Leonard Smith, and Jerry Johnson, some great Masonic leaders within our state. Other valley positions are also appointed by the SGIG. I was going to go through and list all of these guys, but I indeed didn't want this turned into an eye test or people spending time looking for the name of their favorite treasurer or secretary. The important point is, again, these are not progressive line officers. They're appointed at the will and pleasure of the SGIG, and they serve until their retirement or their removal by the SGIG. We finally get to the actual presiding administrative officers of valleys, and here we finally have what we would call our traditional progressive Masonic lines. 4 bodies, the Lodge of Perfection, the Chapter Rose Croix, the Council of Kadosh, and the Consistory, each headed up by a master or a master by some title, and a progressive line that follows him. Again, I would have wanted to list all of these names, but it got just too difficult to see all of them and get it all in context. But this is here where we see those progressive lines come back, which is very similar to what we see in all other Masonic bodies. Each of these progressive line officers serves for 1 year, but a real odd idiosyncrasy in Minnesota, and I know this is true for Minneapolis and St. Paul and Duluth. For some reason, in our idiosyncratic past, the officers are elected every year, but it is traditional for them to serve 2 years. So a 6-man progressive line means it's 12 years from start to finish. And brethren, I just submit to you that that's the definition of Masonic leadership, someone who commits 12 years in a progressive line so that they get a chance to serve our Scottish Rite. One more slide on the valley organizations, and that is within each of the Scottish Rite valleys, there's one of those progressive lines, typically the Lodge of Perfection, conducts all the business as you would in your Blue Lodge, holds a stated monthly meeting, the voting on petitions, and indeed the paying of the bills is done out of the Lodge of Protection. I do now want to talk to our Scottish Rite degrees, and particularly the symbols within our Scottish Rite degrees. Those degrees, as we know, are of progression of philosophical, moral, and intellectual teachings and the search for truth, not the search for a truth, but the search for truth overall and how to discern fact from fiction, legend from allegory. And an important reminder, and this will show up in 2 weeks, the great thing about Scottish Rite Masonry and York Rite Masonry have in common is that the lessons taught are not all the time taught in the order in which the events were alleged to occur. The great number of symbols within the Scottish Rite degrees adds to that mystery and that study, because we know in the Blue Lodge, again here in a non-tiled meeting, not going into those symbols, in the Blue Lodge, most but not all of the symbols represented there are explained to the initiate. The Scottish Rite, not so much so. The quote, "We do not reveal our secrets without compensation," is not really a statement of we're going to demand you pay, but that compensation is really deemed as you need to invest further study, and then the secrets will become unveiled to you. This is kind of an interesting way to look at the 33 degrees that exist within the Scottish Rite. Yep, there are 33. I've divided them into 6 sets because I've never seen anybody divide them this way before, and it's my presentation, so there. The first 3 set of degrees, and this is an important point, are actually a very unique Scottish Rite experience. They are labeled the same and called the same and have mostly the same philosophical and moral pursuits as the first 3 degrees in Masonry in the Blue Lodge in Minnesota, but they are a separate and distinct entity within the Scottish Rite. But for the sake of acceptance, the Scottish Rite accepts the 3 degrees of Minnesota Masonry as equivalent and preparatory. The next 4 sets of degrees within the Scottish Rite are all contained, as I illustrated earlier, in these 4 bodies: the Lodge of Perfection, Chapter Rose Croix, Council Kadosh, and the Consistory, as you see those degrees laid out. For the sake of time, I'm just not going to dive into the description of each of the degrees in each of these bodies. I know there's plenty of other literature and information available. I would encourage anyone who is interested to go pursue that or come back and visit your Scottish Rite for the degrees. Time does not suffice to dive into all of it here, but I've got one more degree. Whoops, and here's I would go through. I did want to go through 4th through the 14th degree, the ineffable degrees that pursue the final word, the lost word of Freemasonry, in a way, the word ineffable meaning that cannot be spoken. The Chapter Rose Croix degrees, 4 of them, deal with the rebuilding of the temple, not just the Temple of Solomon, but actually rebuilding of one's inner temple. And I'll leave the symbology at that. The Council of Kadosh degrees are the philosophical and chivalric degrees of the Scottish Rite, which end up seeing a really interesting overlap with the York Rite degrees. The official degrees, the 31st and 32nd, culminate in one becoming a 32nd degree Scottish Rite Mason. I put this slide in earlier in the day today because it's actually a question that came up to me not that many years ago from a guy who had been a longtime member of the Scottish Rite. Dave, I hear you talk about these bodies all the time, but which one do I belong to? I kind of like all of the degrees, but which body do I belong to? And the answer, very fortunately, is you belong to all of them. Once you complete the last degree in each of these sets of degrees, You become a member of that body, and so by definition, a 32nd degree Scottish Rite Mason is a member of all 4 of the bodies within his valley. Interesting question that came up. Of course, there is one final degree, the 33rd degree. It belongs to what was called the Court of Honor. The Knight Commander of the Court of Honor is not a degree, but it's an investiture, one of honors. The 33rd degree is the last and final degree of the ancient and accepted Scottish Rite. The investiture and the degree, safe it to say, are left for those men, those Masons who have distinguished themselves in service to the Scottish Rite, to Masonry, to our country, or to humanity. And I won't delve a whole lot more into that degree or the investiture because there's many, many other things written about that. In Minnesota, part of the great tradition we have is the tradition of the ritual and the putting together of that ritual and putting the lessons of each of the degrees into context. These ritual performances are indeed very, very similar to what one sees in the first 3 degrees, or particularly the 3rd degree in your Blue Lodge, but take it to a completely additional level by looking at the stories and lessons and the philosophy behind those degrees. But a key part of what I know every valley in Minnesota concentrates on is education, both before and after the degrees, helping the new initiate understand what is involved in that degree. What are the symbols? How do I unpack them? How do I understand them? But there's also another important piece that differentiates Scottish Rite Masonry and indeed York Rite Masonry from the Blue Lodge, and that is there is no further catechism in the Scottish Rite or in the York Rite. An initiate, a candidate, is no longer required to recite from memory a series of fixed questions and answers or precepts. The person is there to learn if they can learn. And that's a really great benefit of the education within the Scottish Rite. Hans is online here. There he is there doing his education thing at our Minneapolis Valley. I want to bring one more point to bear. When we talk about that educational experience, it is very, very clear from the 4 SGIGs that I have known and participated with in my career at the Scottish Rite. One of the grounding touchstones is in our education, in our Scottish Rite, we will not be telling an initiate or a candidate what to think. We are going to tell them how to go about thinking. Think for yourselves, and here's some tools to think for yourself, but we're not going to give you the answers or what someone supposes the answers to be. There is, on the path of education, an additional Supreme Council-sponsored independent study course, which is just phenomenal. It's an individualized self-study correspondence course based on material from the Supreme Council. It is not open to Master Masons. It's open only to Scottish Rite Masons. But again, demonstrating the commitment back to the Blue Lodges, the first of these 3 study courses actually focuses back on the history and the legends inside the Blue Lodge. And anyone who just loves that education will really appreciate the Master Craftsman program. I want to finish up talking about Scottish Rite Masonry in Minnesota by pointing out indeed some of the giants in our Scottish Rite that I haven't had a chance to talk about yet. Illustrious brother Jerry Oliver is our past Sovereign Grand Inspector General. He served our Supreme Council from 2002 until his retirement in 2017, first as a deputy for Minnesota, and then in 2003 he was elected our SGIG. You can't go very far in Masonry without seeing and running into or even hearing from Jerry Oliver, because he's a grand presence in Masonry and in Scottish Rite Masonry. I would be remiss without acknowledging these three giants. Each of these men has been awarded the Grand Cross Court of Honor from our Supreme Council, the highest individual honor that can be bestowed by the Supreme Council. I don't know the exact number right now. I think there are probably only 20 or 25 living Grand Cross members across the United States and across the southern jurisdiction. Three of them here in Minnesota. Jim Burlingame Sr., my predecessor as the personal representative in Minneapolis, Pete Ekholm and Jerry Johnson, just giants in Masonry in Minnesota and in our Scottish Rite. One of the things we always want to strive for in every Masonic body is engagement, especially engagement in the dramatic lessons presented in our degrees. And so we are always talking with, probing, and engaging candidates and members to become active in whatever way, shape, or form gets you active and engaged in the Scottish Rite. In each of the valleys is either, at least exists, and some places stronger than others, a Knights of St. Andrews, which is a great way for brand new Scottish Rite Masons who may not be as familiar with their valley, haven't had the opportunity of this great presentation on Scottish Rite Masonry. The Knights of St. Andrew is a great way for them to become integrated, become involved, and become engaged in their valley with other very early Scottish Rite Masons in their careers. We have our philanthropy in Right Care. I won't go into a great deal about this philanthropy other than to say it has made a tremendous impact on families and particularly on children as they struggle to develop speech and language capability at an early age. Our history in Scottish Rite Masonry in the United States is just replete with examples of children and family, amazing success stories of those who we have helped just become engaged and involved by giving them the benefit of speech and language at an early age. Each of our valleys also has another very personal and private philanthropy called our almoner. If you remember back on my earlier slide, this man is one of the appointed leaders in the valley, and his job is to seek out and find those in the valley or those in our society or those in our city who are in need, who need a little extra support, a little extra help or comfort. And the almoner's job is to find them and as anonymously as possible, help them financially, if necessary, to get their feet back underneath them and be a member of society. It's just a fantastic, very, very quiet philanthropy within our Scottish Rite. Brothers all, I've taken probably a little more time than I'd planned. I hope that that was helpful and informative. I know I've packed a lot in here. Very, very clearly, if you see something that's intrigued you, I respectfully request reach out to me, reach out to any Scottish Rite Mason you may know. I'm sure someone will be very happy to give you an answer, whether or not it be a right answer or a wrong answer, but they'll give you an answer because they're rarely bashful. And with that, I will say thank you very much and open it up for any questions.
Excellent. Thank you for a great presentation. Very thorough and you know, sponge for knowledge. Got to learn some new things that as a Scottish Rite member, I greatly appreciated that. Thank you. Brothers, what kind of stuff I seen on the message board? Really not a lot came up. Worshipful Brother Jason had plugged. There is, for your entertainment, and I believe this is actively going on Thursday evenings, there is a Scottish Rite Zoominar education series. So please cruise over to the Orient Valley there and check those out and register. And then I also plugged the Right Care is also available on a link. So I'm going to begin the poll, but by all means, brothers, go ahead and begin open discussion.
And the link that I posted was the description of the degrees that we have on our Scottish Rite website. We have a little description of the responsibilities and duties and stuff for each of those degrees if you want to read a little bit more on what Dave had.
Nice, very nice. Thanks for clarifying that.
Question for David. If there's no progressive line, how do the 33 members of the Supreme Council then elect the Supreme Grand Commander?
They basically, I don't know, because I've not been involved in that. The Sovereign Grand Commander, when there is an opening for that position, he is elected unanimously by the other members of the Supreme Council. Clearly, there is a progression in assignments within the Supreme Council, but there is not a deputy. Well, I take that back. There is actually a deputy Grand Commander by title, but when that opening exists in the Supreme Council, it is by ballot from the members of the Supreme Council. It's rather an interesting set of things that I have very little knowledge of.
Thank you. Very nice.
Absolutely. Bueller, anyone?
I just want to jump in and say thank you, Dave, for taking the time to do the presentation and being willing to do the next one coming up in 2 weeks when I asked if you'd be willing to do said presentation. So
I am obviously very willing. I was a little more in trepidation because I only had to ask one guy, Tony, if it was okay to do this. In the case of the York Rite, I did go to all three of the current progressive line governing leaders at the state, and they all said, gosh, yes, if Dave's willing to do that, we'll all duck aside. And so nice ducking on the part of those three guys.
So is there
anything else?
A question for you. So in other countries, other than the ones that are listed, there are other Scottish Rite councils, is there not? Or is that?
There are other Supreme Councils around the world. There will be Supreme Councils in some of the European countries, but all of them are derived from the Mother Supreme Council of the world, which is our southern jurisdiction. So when if you do get a chance, when they do have a Supreme Council session in Washington, all of those other Supreme Councils are recognized by and introduced by our leaders in the southern Masonic jurisdiction. So yes, there are other Supreme Councils around the world, and they have their own set of jurisdiction within their countries or groups of countries. Yes.
I would also be amiss to not point out that other than this year, the biannual session is open to other people and to anybody to watch and to participate or see down there in DC every 2 years. So if you have any interest in seeing it, you can, most every 2 years you can go visit. This year they've had to change it due to COVID, but.
Yeah, that is true. I didn't hear from Tony as to if and when there was a last time that there was not a biennial Supreme Council session. It's entirely possible that there was not during World War II. One can certainly understand that. It's entirely possible there was not one back in 1918 and 1919 when there was another pandemic, but I do not know if there's history of there not being a Supreme Council session, a biennial session every 2 years. I take that. There will be a biennial session this year. It just won't be open for the general public. That's an important point.
Excellent. Brother Tim, I believe you had your hand raised. Was there a question?
I just yes, I just wanted to let Dave know what you and the rest of the guys have been doing during this last year has made a big difference in my life. And I'm so grateful that I became a Scottish Rite Mason. This education stuff that you guys are doing is just incredible. And I'm on my knees thanking you guys every day. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. Greatly appreciate it.
Thank you, brother. Brothers, by all means, continue to converse here. I'm just going to quickly share a couple of the closing slides so we can get that preliminary out of the way. This just gives you what our upcoming events. We covered that in the intro. So just one last kind of look at that. The next week will be Finding Time For. So that'll be an interesting by Worshipful Brother Bradley Phelps. And as we had heard tonight, be back in 2 weeks to learn about the York Rite Masonry in Minnesota. And also, brothers, the mentoring committee of our Grand Lodge is looking for more presenters. So if there's someone out there that you know has some really good content on the Masonic edifice of any nature, please feel free to reach out via email or phone number. You can always just reach out to your Grand Lodge to get connected with the mentoring committee too, as well, if you do not have any of this information. So I will stop sharing at this point, and thank you again for a great presentation. I'll turn it over to our brothers.
Dave, thanks for kind of this presentation. It was very insightful. I knew a lot about the Scottish Rite, but you surprised me with a couple of nuggets as well. One thing that I'm always was a little bit curious about is that the Scottish Rite has, by and large, some pretty impressive properties, and properties that are in high need of maintenance. I mean, all the buildings are by nature, just pretty expensive to maintain. Are these properties owned by the state, or meaning the valley, or are they owned by a consortium of valleys, or is this something that goes through the southern jurisdiction at large in Washington?